In the shadow of eternity, there exists a scroll, ancient, weathered, written in blood and tears across the sands of time. And within its sacred pages lies a name that would one day shake the very foundations of our world: Iran. But long before this name struck fear into the hearts of nations, long before nuclear threats and proxy wars, long before the evening news made it a household word of terror, there was something else, something hidden, something prophetic. What if I told you that nearly 3,000 years ago, while the ashes of Solomon's temple still smoldered in Jerusalem, a Hebrew prophet named Ezekiel received a vision so terrifying, so precise, that it would map out the final chapter of human history? And at the center of that vision was the ancient kingdom we now call Iran. You see, Iran was never just a political entity. It was never just another Middle Eastern power. From the moment Cyrus the Great was anointed by God himself to rebuild Jerusalem's temple, to the chilling prophecies of Ezekiel that named Persia as a key player in the final war, Iran has been woven into the very DNA of biblical prophecy. But here's what will send a chill down your spine. Every single detail that Ezekiel saw in that ancient vision, every alliance, every enemy, every geographical marker, is aligning before our very eyes. The nations are taking their positions. The chess pieces are moving across the board of history, and the clock, the prophetic clock, is ticking louder than ever. Tonight, we're going to open that scroll together. We're going to trace the bloodline of prophecy from the courts of ancient Persia to the headlines of today. Because what you're about to discover isn't just history, it's destiny, and it's unfolding in real time. But before we begin this sacred journey together, I want to thank every single one of you who has supported this message through super thanks. Your generosity means more than you know. You're not just donating, you're helping spread light to others who feel alone in their calling. Whether you give or not, I'm deeply grateful for your presence here. Your support, your time, your attention, it all matters. And if this message resonates with your soul, go ahead and plant that seed of faith. Now, are you ready to discover why the ancient prophets whispered Iran's name with trembling voices? Are you prepared to see how a nation born in the pages of Genesis would become the harbinger of Revelation? Because once you see what the scriptures really say about Iran, you'll never look at the evening news the same way again. The question that will haunt you tonight is this: if the prophets saw Iran's role in the final chapter, what else did they see about our generation that we've been missing? Let's find out. The wind moved through the valley of dry bones, but the bones were listening. Picture this: May 14th, 1948. The sun sets over a land that has been silent for nearly 2,000 years. A land where prophets once walked, where kings once ruled, where the very voice of God once thundered from Mount Sinai. But for centuries, it has been nothing more than dust and memory. The Jewish people scattered like seeds on the wind, cast to every corner of the earth, their homeland a graveyard of broken dreams and buried promises. And then, in a single moment, something impossible happens. David Ben-Gurion stands before a microphone in Tel Aviv and speaks 6 words that shatter the silence of ages. The state of Israel is established. The bones begin to breathe. What you witnessed that day wasn't just the birth of a modern nation. It was the resurrection of a prophecy. You see, 26 centuries earlier, a Hebrew prophet named Ezekiel had been given a vision so vivid, so impossible, that it would have sounded like madness to anyone listening. He saw a valley filled with dry bones, scattered, lifeless, forgotten. And then he heard the voice of the Almighty: "Son of man, can these bones live?" The answer came not in words, but in wind. "Prophesy to these bones," God commanded. "Say to them, O dry bones, hear the word of the Lord." And as Ezekiel spoke, something miraculous began to unfold. Bone connected to bone, sinew and flesh appeared, bodies formed, but they were still lifeless, until the breath of God filled their lungs. "These bones," the Lord declared, "are the whole house of Israel." They say, "Our bones are dried up and our hope is gone. We are cut off. But I will open your graves and bring you up from them, and you will know that I am the Lord." Have you ever witnessed a resurrection not of a person, but of a prophecy? Because that's exactly what began in 1948. After 19 centuries of exile, after pogroms and persecution, after the unimaginable horror of the Holocaust, the Jewish people didn't just survive, they returned. They came from the camps of Europe, from the deserts of North Africa, from the hidden communities of the Soviet Union. They came speaking dozens of languages, carrying the scars of 1,000 different sufferings. But they came home, and the land itself began to breathe again. Deserts bloomed, cities rose from ruins. The Hebrew language, dead for centuries, became the voice of children playing in the streets of Jerusalem. Ezekiel had seen it all. "I will take you out of the nations. I will gather you from all the countries and bring you back into your own land. You will live in the land I gave your ancestors. You will be my people, and I will be your God." But here's what sends a chill through the soul. This wasn't just about restoration. It was about preparation. Because in the very next chapter of Ezekiel's vision, chapter 38, the prophet sees something that should make every person alive today pause and tremble. He sees the regathered Israel, prosperous and secure, suddenly surrounded by enemies. Nations from the far north, from the ancient lands of Persia, from distant coastlands, all gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. The bones have stood up. The flesh has returned. The breath has filled the lungs. But breath alone is not enough, for the storm that follows demands blood. Before Cyrus ever breathed, heaven had already spoken his name. Picture this. In the darkness of Babylonian exile, while Jerusalem lay in ruins and God's people wept by foreign rivers, an aging prophet named Isaiah receives a vision that would shatter every assumption about how God works in history. The year is approximately 700 BC. Cyrus the Great won't be born for another century. The Persian Empire doesn't even exist yet. And yet, God calls this unborn pagan king by name. "I am the Lord who says of Cyrus, 'He is my shepherd and will accomplish all that I please.' He will say of Jerusalem, 'Let it be rebuilt,' and of the temple, 'Let its foundations be laid.'" Isaiah 44-28. But it doesn't stop there. In the very next chapter, the Almighty does something that will echo through eternity. This is what the Lord says to his anointed, to Cyrus. Isaiah 45-1. Anointed, the same Hebrew word used for David, the same sacred title reserved for Israel's kings and priests. And God gives it to a Persian ruler who doesn't even know him yet. Can you feel the cosmic shockwave of that moment? The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob calling a foreign emperor his anointed one. It's scandalous. It's impossible. It's divine. Fast forward 150 years. Daniel, the Hebrew prophet, stands in the very heart of Babylon's palace, interpreting dreams for kings who have crushed his homeland. And in the visions, God shows him 4 great beasts rising from the sea, empires that will rule the earth. There it is again, Persia, the silver chest of Nebuchadnezzar's golden statue, the lopsided bear with ribs in its teeth, the ram charging east and west and north, unstoppable in its conquest. But here's what will stop your heart. Daniel doesn't just see Persia's rise. He sees its purpose. This empire, this collection of Median and Persian tribes from the mountains of Iran, would become the instrument of Israel's deliverance, the destroyer of Babylon, the rebuilder of Jerusalem. And then it happens. Cyrus the Great, exactly as prophesied, sweeps down from the Iranian plateau. Babylon falls without a battle. And on that first year of his reign, this pagan king issues a decree that reverberates through history. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. Ezra 1-2. Think about that. A Persian emperor, raised on Zoroastrian fire altars, proclaiming the God of Israel as sovereign over all the earth. This isn't political maneuvering. This is prophecy incarnate. But here's the mystery that should make you tremble. How does God's greatest instrument of mercy for Israel become, in the final chapters of Scripture, one of her greatest threats? How does the nation that rebuilt the temple become the one prophesied to attack it? What if God used your enemy to unlock your destiny? For 70 years, the Jews had stared at Babylon's walls, wondering if God had forgotten his promises. They couldn't see that he was already raising up their deliverer in the mountains of Persia. They couldn't imagine that their salvation would come through a fire-worshipping king who had never heard of Abraham. Sometimes, God's rescue comes wearing the face of your adversary. Sometimes his deliverance arrives speaking a foreign tongue. Sometimes the very nation that terrifies you today is the one he's preparing to use for your tomorrow. But Persia's name was not yet finished being written in fire. In the palace of Susa, a woman crowned with courage stood against annihilation. Picture this: the most powerful empire on earth, stretching from India to Ethiopia, governed by absolute decree. 127 provinces bowing to a single throne. And in the shadows of that throne, a plan so dark, so calculated, that it would have erased the people of God from the face of the earth forever. But this wasn't just palace intrigue. This was spiritual warfare in royal disguise. The year was 474 BC. The Persian Empire ruled the world, and scattered throughout its vast territories lived the remnant of Israel, those who had chosen to remain in exile rather than return to rebuild Jerusalem. They were vulnerable. They were scattered. And they were about to become extinct. Enter Haman the Agagite. That title isn't accidental. Haman was a descendant of Agag, the Amalekite king whom God had commanded Saul to destroy centuries earlier. The same bloodline that had attacked Israel in the wilderness. The same ancient hatred that had sworn to blot out the memory of Israel from under heaven. What you're witnessing in the book of Esther isn't just one man's vendetta. It's the continuation of a satanic strategy that began in Genesis and would resurface again and again throughout history. Haman convinced King Xerxes to sign a decree. On the 13th day of the 12th month, every Jewish man, woman, and child in the empire would be slaughtered. Their property would be plundered. Their bloodline would be extinguished. It was genocide by royal edict, and there was no power on earth that could reverse a Persian law once it was sealed with the king's ring. But what Haman didn't know was that God had already positioned his chess pieces decades before the game began. A Jewish orphan named Hadassah, known in the palace as Esther, had been crowned Queen of Persia, not by accident, not by beauty alone, by divine appointment. The very empire that was about to destroy her people had unknowingly placed their salvation on the throne. When Mordecai brought word of the decree to Esther, he spoke words that echo across eternity. Who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? For such a time as this, 4 words that reveal the hidden architecture of providence. Every step of Esther's journey, the beauty contest she never wanted to enter, the favor she found with a pagan king, the crown placed upon her head, all of it orchestrated for one terrifying, magnificent moment when the survival of Israel would hang in the balance. But here's what will stagger you. Even as Haman was casting lots to determine the perfect day for annihilation, even as the death decree was being copied and distributed to every corner of the empire, God was already writing the reversal. The gallows Haman built for Mordecai would become his own execution platform. The wealth he planned to plunder would be given to those he sought to destroy. The day appointed for Israel's end would become their day of triumph. This is the pattern that runs like a golden thread through every attempt to destroy God's people. Egypt's oppression became Israel's exodus. Babylon's captivity became Persia's restoration. Haman's final solution became his own final hour. How many times has God saved you without your knowing you were in danger? How many schemes against your life, your family, your faith were turned to ash before you even knew they existed? The book of Esther reveals that the same God who turned Haman's plot into Israel's protection is still moving in the shadows of our story today. But not all threats wear crowns. Some wear steel. He will come like a cloud, but the sky will not forgive him. In the frozen wastelands north of the Black Sea, where ancient maps fade into mystery and modern satellites peer through endless snow, there lies a land that has haunted the dreams of prophets for millennia. A land whose very name sends tremors through the pages of Scripture. A land called Magog. 26 centuries ago, while Jerusalem's stones still wept from Babylonian fire, the prophet Ezekiel received a vision so terrifying that angels themselves must have trembled. He saw armies gathering in the uttermost north. He saw a Princeia ruler of such power that nations would bow before his throne. And he saw this prince being dragged southward by invisible hooks, pulled by divine force toward a destiny written in blood and judgment. The prophet called him Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, the one who would come from the land of Magog. But here's what will make your soul shiver. Every ancient map, every historical record, every scholarly trace points to one unmistakable truth. Magog is the land we now call Russia, and Gog. Gog is the title of the one who rules from that frozen throne. What if I told you that the greatest war of tomorrow was written before your ancestors were born? What if every headline about Russian military movements, every alliance forged in Moscow's shadows, every threat whispered in the Kremlin's halls, was already seen by a Hebrew prophet 26 centuries ago? Listen to the precision of this ancient prophecy. I will turn you around, put hooks into your jaws, and bring you out with all your army. Think about that image: hooks in the jaws. Not the willing march of a conqueror, but the desperate lunge of a beast being dragged against its will into a trap it cannot see. For decades, Russia stayed distant from Middle Eastern affairs. But something changed. Something began pulling that northern giant southward. First came the military bases in Syria, just miles from Israel's border. Then the weapons deals with Iran. Then the joint military exercises. Then the strategic partnerships that would have seemed impossible just 20 years ago. The hooks are tightening. Ezekiel saw this leader gathering a coalition not of willing allies, but of desperate nations bound together by hatred for one small strip of land. Persia would be there. Libya would be there. Sudan would be there. And at the head of this unholy alliance would stand the Prince of the North, his jaw caught in divine hooks, being pulled toward a battle he thinks he chose but was chosen for him before time began. Do you see the terrifying beauty of it? Even in rebellion, even in hatred, even in the march toward destruction, God's sovereignty reigns. The enemy thinks he's writing his own story, but he's only fulfilling words spoken by a captive prophet in ancient Babylon. But here's the most chilling part of Ezekiel's vision. This northern prince doesn't come to conquer. He comes to die. The mountains of Israel will become his graveyard. The land he sought to plunder will become the place where his armies are buried for 7 months. And the name of the valley where his bones rest will become a testimony to all nations that the God of Israel defends his own. The stage is set. The players are taking their positions. And somewhere in the halls of power, in places where decisions shape the destiny of nations, the ancient hooks are beginning to pull. And now, the ancient alliance awakens. The name changed, but the hatred remained. In 1935, something shifted in the ancient halls of power. The kingdom that had once carried the torch of God's deliverance quietly changed its name. Persia became Iran. A simple administrative decision, they said. A modernization, but in the spiritual realm, where names carry the weight of destiny and identity shapes eternity, nothing is ever that simple. You see, this was the same Persia that God had used as his instrument of mercy, the same empire that had sent the exiles home, rebuilt the temple, and protected his people when genocide loomed. Cyrus the Great had been called God's anointed. Queen Esther had worn the crown of this very kingdom. The Magi who worshipped the infant Jesus had journeyed from these ancient lands. But something had changed, something darker. By the time the new name took hold, the same nation that had once kissed the feet of Jewish exiles was now plotting their destruction. The spiritual DNA remained the same. This was still the land of Madai, still the territory Ezekiel saw in his terrifying vision. But the heart had turned to stone. And then came 1979, the year everything exploded into prophetic clarity. When the Islamic Revolution swept through Iran like wildfire, it wasn't just a political upheaval, it was a spiritual realignment. Suddenly, this ancient kingdom that had once protected God's people was now declaring them the little Satan. The same lips that had once proclaimed mercy now spat curses toward Jerusalem. The transformation was complete. But here's what will send chills through your soul. Ezekiel saw this coming 26 centuries before the Ayatollahs took power, before nuclear centrifuges spun in underground facilities, before proxy armies gathered in Gaza and Lebanon. The prophet wrote these haunting words: Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Persia, not Iran, not some vague reference to the region. Persia, the very kingdom that had once served God's purposes, now standing in the ranks of his enemies. Do you feel the weight of that betrayal? Can you sense the cosmic irony? The nation that God had used to restore his people was now destined to be among those who would attempt their final destruction. Today, as we watch Iran fund Hamas rockets, as we see Hezbollah missiles pointed at Israeli cities, as we witness the nuclear program that could incinerate Jerusalem in minutes, we're not just watching geopolitics unfold, we're watching prophecy breathe. We're seeing the ancient scroll of Ezekiel unroll before our very eyes. But perhaps the most chilling detail of all is this: Iran is no longer acting alone. Those same militant proxies that terrorize Israel's borders, they're not random terrorist groups. They're the advance guard of something far more sinister, the tentacles of an ancient hatred that has found new forms, new weapons, new allies. And if you look closely at the alliances forming today, Russia providing weapons, China offering economic support, Turkey playing both sides, you'll begin to see the shadow of that five-nation coalition that Ezekiel described. The pieces are moving into position. The stage is being set. The question that should terrify every believer is this: what happens when a nation once used by God now defies him? What happens when the instrument of mercy becomes the weapon of judgment? History is about to give us the answer. But Persia would not march alone. Shadows gather from the south. They are not named in the prophecy, but their silence is thunder. In the ancient scrolls of Ezekiel, there exists a haunting absence, a deafening quiet that speaks louder than any war cry. Because when the prophet received his vision of the final assault against Israel, he saw 5 nations marching from the north. But listen carefully to who he didn't see: Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Syria. The very nations that have bloodied their swords against Israel for decades are nowhere to be found in Ezekiel's final war. The enemies who surrounded the newborn state in 1948, who launched rockets and tanks and hatred across every border, they are silent in the prophecy. And that silence, that divine omission, may be the most chilling detail of all. Instead, Ezekiel's vision reveals a different coalition. Nations that seemed impossible, improbable, almost random to the ancient mind. But to our modern eyes, they form a pattern so precise it takes your breath away. Cush, the ancient name for what we now call Sudan, a nation that has quietly, methodically aligned itself with both Russia and Iran in recent years. Russian naval bases now dot Sudan's coastline along the Red Sea. Iranian weapons flow through Sudanese ports. The black banner of Cush has been raised not in the traditional Arab coalition, but in the prophetic one Ezekiel foresaw. Put, modern-day Libya, a nation torn by civil war, yes, but also a nation that has opened its airspace to Russian military aircraft. Advanced air defense systems, Russian-made, now guard Libyan soil. What was once Italian territory has become a staging ground for the Northern Bear. And Togarma, ancient Turkey, the nation that bridges Europe and Asia, that controls the Bosphorus, that has become an unlikely partner to both Moscow and Tehran. Turkish President Erdogan's words against Israel grow sharper each year. His military coordination with Russia in Syria grows deeper. The House of Togarma is taking its prophetic position. But here's what will shake you to your core. These nations didn't choose each other randomly. They were drawn together by invisible threads, pulled by forces beyond political calculation. Because when God speaks a thing into existence through his prophets, history bends to fulfill it. The traditional enemies of Israel, Egypt, Jordan, the Gulf states. They've been making peace, the Abraham Accords, normalized relations, quiet diplomacy, as if their ancient hatred has been subdued, as if their voices have been hushed, not by human negotiation, but by divine orchestration. Can you see it? While the world focused on the obvious conflicts, God was repositioning the chess pieces for his final game. While diplomats celebrated peace treaties, the real coalition was forming in the shadows. Russia training with Iran, Sudan hosting Russian bases, Libya opening its skies, Turkey choosing sides. The silence of Israel's traditional enemies isn't political progress. It's prophetic precision. Because in God's economy, sometimes what doesn't happen is just as significant as what does. When Ezekiel saw this vision 26 centuries ago, how could he have known that Egypt would one day shake hands with Israel? How could he have foreseen that Jordan would become a quiet ally? How could he have predicted that the loudest voices of 1948 would become the silent watchers of the final hour? Unless this wasn't human vision at all. Unless this was divine revelation, downloaded from the throne room of eternity into the heart of a Hebrew exile. The players are positioned, and the mountain watches. The invasion begins, but the earth rejects them. From the rugged peaks of the Golan Heights, you can see three nations at once: Syria to the north and east, Lebanon to the northwest, and below, the fertile valleys of northern Israel, where ancient armies once marched and modern missiles now threaten. This is not just geography. This is the theater of prophecy. 26 centuries ago, when Ezekiel received his vision of the final war, he saw something that would have seemed impossible to his generation. 5 distant nations, Russia, Iran, Sudan, Libya, and Turkey, would one day unite as a single military force and descend upon Israel from the north, not from the south where Egypt waits, not from the east where Jordan sits, but from the north through the very mountains where Jesus once walked and where Israeli tanks now patrol. The prophet wrote with trembling hands, "You will come from your place in the far north, you and many nations with you, all of them riding on horses, a great horde, a mighty army. You will advance against my people Israel, like a cloud that covers the land." Picture it, the rumble of engines, echoing through ancient valleys. Helicopter blades cutting through the same air where angels once announced the Messiah's birth. The thunder of artillery where shepherds once heard heavenly choirs. This is not just war. This is the collision of two kingdoms, earthly and eternal. But here's where the prophecy becomes breathtaking. Just as this massive coalition reaches the borders of Israel, just as their weapons are trained on the mountains of Judea, something happens that no military strategist could predict. The earth itself becomes God's weapon. On that day there shall be a great earthquake in the land of Israel, Ezekiel declares. Not just any earthquake, the greatest seismic event in Israel's history, mountains splitting, communications severed, carefully planned invasion routes crumbling into chaos, the very ground rejecting the feet of those who come to destroy God's people. And then, confusion descends like a plague. I will call for a sword against Gog throughout all my mountains, says the Lord. Every man's sword will be against his brother. Alliance turns to betrayal. Coordinated strikes become friendly fire. The invasion force devours itself from within, as if struck by divine madness. But the climax is yet to come. From the heavens falls something beyond human warfare. I will rain down on him and his troops, and the many nations with him, torrential rains, hailstones and burning sulfur, fire from above, judgment from the throne room of eternity, the kind of devastation that leaves the land uninhabitable for months. 7 months, Ezekiel tells us. 7 months before the cleanup can even begin. And when it does, it's unlike any battlefield restoration in history. Search teams mark locations, but dare not touch. Specialists in protective gear bury the fallen in distant zones, far from populated areas. The protocol sounds eerily familiar to anyone who understands nuclear contamination. What if the next world war begins with the roar of engines and ends with the breath of God? What if modern military might meet ancient divine power? What if the nations discover that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has never surrendered his sovereignty over the mountains of Israel? In that moment, when the dust settles and the fires cool, something will become undeniably clear to every eye that witnesses it. This was not military victory. This was divine intervention. This was the hand of the Almighty moving across the chessboard of nations, reminding the world that he still writes the final chapter of history. But this war birthed something the world has not seen in 2,000 years. And Israel shall know that I am the Lord. From that day forward, in the silence that follows thunder, something stirs. In the aftermath of fire and earthquake, when the smoke clears and the bodies are counted, when 5 armies lie scattered across the mountains like broken dolls, something deeper awakens. You see, divine intervention doesn't just save nations. It transforms them. Picture this moment. Israeli soldiers standing on the Golan Heights, staring at the wreckage of what should have been their annihilation. Russian tanks, overturned like toys. Iranian missiles exploded in their own launchers. Turkish artillery buried under supernatural hailstones. And in that eerie quiet, as the dust settles over what was meant to be Israel's grave, a whisper begins to spread through the ranks. This was not our victory. Ezekiel saw this moment with crystal clarity. He watched as a nation that had wrestled with God for millennia would finally stop wrestling. From that day forward, the prophet declared, "The house of Israel will know that I am the Lord their God." Not hope, not believe, not suspect. They will know. But what kind of knowing is this? What awakens in the human heart when survival becomes undeniably supernatural? When deliverance arrives not through strategy or strength, but through the very hand of heaven. For nearly 2,000 years, the Jewish people have carried a wound in their collective soul, scattered, persecuted, surviving, yes, but always questioning. Where is God in our suffering? Where was he in our exile? Where was he when the ovens burned and the world stayed silent? And then this impossible rescue, this divine theater where the creator of the universe steps onto the stage of human history and declares, "These are my people, and no weapon formed against them shall prosper." What if I told you that this awakening won't be merely national, but deeply personal? That hearts hardened by centuries of disappointment will crack open like desert ground receiving rain. That eyes clouded by theological tradition will suddenly see with startling clarity? The Apostle Paul saw this day coming. Writing to the Romans, he declared with prophetic certainty, "And so all Israel will be saved. Not some, not many, all, as if a veil would be lifted, as if scales would fall from an entire nation's eyes." Could this be the moment when Israel stops seeing Jesus as the Gentile Messiah and recognizes him as their own? When the carpenter from Nazareth is finally welcomed home by his brothers? When the name that was rejected becomes the name that saves? Imagine Jerusalem in the aftermath. Synagogues packed, not with ritual, but with revelation. Rabbis studying not just Torah, but Tanakh, seeing messianic prophecies with new eyes. Young Israelis who grew up secular, suddenly hungry for the God who fought for them. Orthodox Jews recognizing that their Messiah didn't come to condemn, but to complete. This is more than revival. This is recognition. This is the moment when the chosen people choose their chooser. But what does this mean for you? What if the battle you've been dreading in your own life is actually the doorway to your deliverance? What if God allows the storm because he knows the calm that waits on the other side? What if the very thing that threatens to destroy you is the catalyst for your greatest awakening? But the fire doesn't just fall on Israel's enemies. It touches the coastlands. And so the ancient scroll closes. But not the story. Only the chapter. We have journeyed together through the corridors of time, from the tent of Noah to the throne rooms of kings, from the ruins of Babylon to the headlines of today. And in every age, in every season, one name has echoed through the chambers of prophecy like a whisper that refuses to die. Persia, Iran, the land of the Medes and the kingdom of Cyrus. The empire that rose from dust and returns to dust, yet somehow never truly disappears. Think of the arc we have witnessed. First, God's chosen instrument, Cyrus the Great, anointed before his birth, called by name across the centuries to rebuild what had been destroyed. Then, God's shelter of protection, the Persian court, where Esther's courage saved a people from extinction, the realm where Daniel's wisdom illuminated the mysteries of heaven. But empires, like men, carry within them the seeds of their own transformation, and what began as blessing would one day become judgment. What served as sanctuary would eventually stand as adversary, for we have seen the darker thread woven through this tapestry. The same Persia that once sent Jews home to rebuild their temple now sends missiles to destroy their cities. The same bloodline that once bowed before the God of Israel now swears by other gods to wipe Israel from the map. Could it be that this too was written? That even rebellion serves the purposes of the Almighty? That Iran's defiance is not the end of the story, but the setup for its most glorious chapter? Because here is what stirs the depths of prophecy. If Cyrus could be called God's anointed while still worshiping false gods, if a pagan king could fulfill divine purposes without even knowing the God he served, what prevents the same mercy from falling on Iran today? What if the fire that Ezekiel saw falling on the coastlands is not merely judgment but purification? What if the God who once used Persia to deliver his people is preparing to deliver Persia itself? You see, we live in days when prophecies are not merely studied, they are witnessed. When ancient visions don't just inspire sermons, they inspire headlines. The alliances Ezekiel described are forming before our eyes. The conflicts Isaiah predicted are erupting on our screens. The spiritual awakening Jeremiah proclaimed may be stirring even now in hearts we cannot see. And you are not merely observers of this unfolding drama. You are participants, You are the generation chosen to live in the convergence of the ages, when the promises made to Abraham begin their final fulfillment, when the visions given to Daniel start their ultimate countdown. The question that haunts me and should haunt you is this: if Iran's story began with divine calling, and if its middle chapters have been marked by divine judgment, what if its final chapter is destined for divine redemption? What if the mullahs who rage against Israel today become the leaders who bow before Israel's Messiah tomorrow? What if the missiles pointed at Jerusalem become the pathways for pilgrims journeying to worship the King? What if the uranium enriched for destruction becomes the wealth offered at his feet? For this is the mystery of God's heart. He writes no people off. He closes no stories permanently. And the God who turned Saul into Paul, who transformed Nebuchadnezzar's pride into praise, who called Cyrus his anointed, that same God still sits on his throne, still moves in the hearts of kings, still turns ashes into altars. So watch, pray, and remember, in God's economy, the last chapter is never written by human hands. Because in God's hand, even flames of judgment can become fires of revival. And Persia's name may yet be whispered again this time, not in prophecy of war, but in proclamation of worship. The scroll closes. But the story is still being written.